Welcome to this deep dive into the source material. We are incredibly glad you could join us today because we have something sitting on the table that is wildly ambitious, utterly fascinating, and honestly a little bit mind-bending to explore with
It
you.
really is a massive undertaking.
Right? So our mission for this deep dive is to navigate an unpublished English translation of a very specific, very dense historical text. We are looking at Chapter 10 of a 17th century masterwork called Oedipus the Egyptian.
Written by the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher.
Exactly. Now, what we are essentially attempting to unpack here is Kircher's grand, almost terrifyingly complex effort to build what he calls a unified mythosynthetic Egyptian chronology. He's trying to take the ancient historical records of the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Arabs, and the Egyptians and, somehow force them all into one cohesive, undisputed timeline.
Which is an almost impossibly monumental task, especially given the era he was working in. To really grasp the gravity of what we are looking at today, you have to understand the mind of Athanasius Kircher. He was operating in the 1600s and was often referred to as the master of 100 arts.
A real Renaissance man.
Exactly, a genuine polymath. He studied geology, medicine, linguistics, theology, but his approach to history was completely bounded by the worldview of his specific time and his religious convictions.
Which was very rigid.
Extremely. He set out to harmonize the historical narratives of classical secular authors. Ancient writers whose names pop up constantly in this text, people like Berossus, Manetho, Herodotus, Diodorus, and Eusebius, and he wanted to align every single word they wrote with the biblical timeline of the Hebrew scriptures.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle with pieces from 5 different boxes.
That is a perfect way to look at it. Kircher held this fundamental belief that all ancient myths, all the wild stories of gods and monsters, and all secular ancient histories were just distorted, broken reflections of one single true divine history. And he believed, with an incredible amount of academic confidence, that he was the single person capable of decoding all of it.
And you can immediately feel the agonizing weight of that task the moment you start reading his actual words. The very beginning of this manuscript doesn't start with a triumphant thesis. It features Kircher practically tearing his hair out over the sheer unyielding difficulty of what he is trying to accomplish.
He was definitely struggling.
I was struck by the vivid, almost painful metaphors he uses to describe the research process. He writes to his readers that he is, quote, already exhausted by the troublesome flooding of the Nile. And then he says that just as soon as he thinks he has safely navigated those treacherous waters, he is immediately faced with new rocks, new unique precipices that are mutilated and incomplete.
He is talking directly about the ancient historical records themselves there.
Right. He actually complains bitterly that the chronology of the kings of Egypt is so thoroughly corrupted, so confusing, and so full of contradictions that he thinks he knows more easily who he should accuse of lying rather than who he should actually cite as a reliable source.
It is the profound frustration of a scholar who realizes the foundation he is trying to build on is basically made of sand. He is staring down thousands of years of human civilization. These stories and king lists have been passed down through various ancient languages. They have been translated, mistranslated, deliberately altered by rival scribes trying to make their own kings look better, and heavily poeticized.
So it's an absolute mess.
It's a total mess. He is trying to piece together a massive chronological jigsaw puzzle, but he quickly realizes that half the pieces are missing and the other half belong to entirely different puzzles, like you said earlier. He repeatedly laments the corruption of proper names that has occurred over successive ages.
That seems to be his biggest roadblock.
Oh, it is a massive hurdle. Kircher realizes early on that he simply cannot rely on the names of these kings or gods. An Egyptian priest writing in hieroglyphics, a Greek historian writing in Athens 1,000 years later, and an Arab chronicler might all use completely different, totally unrecognizable names for the exact same historical figure.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the methodology Kircher invents to tackle this ultimate puzzle of ancient history is absolutely wild. If you can't trust the names, how do you know who is who?
You look at the actions.
Exactly. Kircher decides that the only way to solve this is to look exclusively at the deeds. If two ancient figures from two entirely different cultures did the exact same highly specific thing, Kircher just assumes they must be the same person hiding under different names.
It's a bold strategy.
And he kicks off this massive synthesis right at the end of the biblical flood in what he categorizes as the dynasty of the gods, or the pre-shepherd era. Now, based on specific historic focus of our dive today, we aren't going to spend too much time bogged down in the earliest biblical patriarchs, but we do need to touch on his starting point.
Right, to set the stage for you.
Following the flood, the biblical narrative says Noah's sons divide the earth. Shem takes Asia, Japheth takes Europe, and Cham, or Ham, gets Africa, and specifically Egypt.
That geographical division is his starting line. But almost immediately, Kircher starts drawing the kind of bold, controversial connections that define this entire manuscript. He looks at Cham, who is just a biblical patriarch, and equates him directly with Zoroaster.
Which is a huge leap.
It really is. He explicitly calls Cham the first author of magic and superstition. He goes even further, linking him to the Egyptian god Osiris and the Persian deity Oromasde. And to justify painting a biblical figure in this dark light, Kircher pulls a rather shocking fragment from the ancient Babylonian writer Berossus.
Oh, this part was intense.
Yeah. Now, Berossus was writing centuries before Kircher, compiling ancient Chaldean histories. According to the fragment Kircher highlights, Cham despised his father, Noah. The story claims that when Noah was lying incapacitated, Cham grasped his father and muttered a dark, ancient magic spell, rendering Noah permanently sterile.
That is just brutal.
Because of this horrific act, Cham is expelled, branded as infamous and shameless. Kircher takes this ancient Babylonian fragment and argues that this specific instance of dark illicit magic is the exact root of all the idolatry and superstition that would eventually consume Egypt.
It is a remarkably dark origin story for an entire civilization. So from Cham, the timeline moves down to his son, Misraim, and just like with the father, Kircher gives Misraim a whole host of alternate mythological identities. I saw he calls him Jupiter Zoroaster, and also the first Egyptian Osiris. But what is Misraim actually doing in this timeline?
Building the foundation of Egypt's magical and physical infrastructure.
Right. According to Kircher, Misraim took his father's dark magical arts and completely institutionalized them. He supposedly invented magical amulets to ward off evil, advanced agricultural techniques, and even claimed to have the power to draw down stars from the sky using spoken incantations.
But he wasn't just casting spells.
No, Kircher is careful to point out he wasn't just a mystical figure casting spells in the desert. He was a massive foundational builder. Kircher credits Misraim with founding the ancient city of Tanis, and more importantly, laying the foundations of the legendary city of Thebes. And this isn't just any city. This is the Thebes, known in antiquity as Hecatompolis, famously described as having 100 massive gates.
The founding of Thebes is a critical pivot point for Kircher because it formally kicks off what he categorizes as the Theban dynasts. This is the era that later generations of Egyptians looked back on and remembered as the golden age when the god-kings ruled the earth.
But they weren't gods.
Exactly. Kircher's perspective, and this is vital to understanding the intellectual framework of this entire manuscript, is that these rulers were absolutely not gods. They were just mortal men. They were the direct descendants of Noah, and because they lived so close to the dawn of post-flood civilization, they possessed immense ancient knowledge about agriculture, structural engineering, and basic astronomy.
But to normal people, that looked like magic.
Precisely. You have to view this through the lens of the uneducated masses of the ancient world. To early people struggling to survive, these advancements in science and statecraft seemed indistinguishable from literal magic. These early kings were venerated with such intense reverence that, as the centuries passed and the stories were handed down orally, their very human achievements were exaggerated, poeticized, and eventually codified into divine mythology.
Which brings us to some of the most entertaining and fascinating parts of Kircher's work, how he actively tries to explain the origins of the famous Greek and Roman gods by pointing to these specific historical Egyptian rulers. Let's look at Mercury, or as the Romans called him, Faunus, and the Egyptians called him Thoth.
The messenger god.
Right. When I read this part of the translation, I couldn't believe how grounded the story actually was. According to the Alexandrian Chronicle, which is one of the later Greek historical texts Kircher leans on, Faunus was the son of a ruler named Jupiter Picus, and he was originally governing over in Italy. But Faunus is a clever guy. He figures out a metallurgical process to refine gold. Suddenly, he's incredibly wealthy, and his brothers get so dangerously jealous that they conspire to kill him.
Classic royal family drama.
So what does Faunus do? He packs up a massive stash of this newly refined gold, flees Italy, and sails across the Mediterranean to Egypt. He shows up in this foreign land, puts on an incredibly dazzling cloak made of woven gold, and starts philosophizing, showing off his wealth, and predicting future events.
Which was probably just meteorology.
It's exactly. Which, if we're being realistic, was probably just him understanding basic astronomy and predicting eclipses or weather patterns, right? But The native Egyptians are so utterly blown away by this charismatic foreigner in a shiny gold coat handing out wealth and predicting the weather that they proclaim him to be a deity. They call him the god Mercury, the divine messenger.
It is a remarkably pragmatic, almost cynical explanation for the birth of a major deity. Kircher strips away all the magic and just sees a clever politician with good timing and a flashy wardrobe. And he applies this exact same dissecting logic to the god Vulcan.
God of the forge.
Right. In Roman mythology, Vulcan is the god of fire, the magical blacksmith of the pantheon who forges thunderbolts under volcanoes. But Kircher, this time citing the Greek historian Diodorus, presents a completely grounded, evolutionary version of the story. Diodorus was a Sicilian Greek historian who traveled to Egypt and tried to write a universal history, often trying to rationalize myths.
And Kircher loves that.
He absolutely loves this approach. According to this rationalized account, Vulcan wasn't a god at all. He was just a very observant early human who happened to be walking in the mountains one day after a terrible storm. He comes across a tree that had been struck by a bolt of lightning. The tree is hollowed out and the inside is burning furiously.
Now, early humans were terrified of fire.
Terrified. But Vulcan doesn't run away. He stays. And he watches it. He notices that as the wood is consumed, the fire dies down. But when he pushes more dry branches into the hollow, the fire roars back to life. He effectively discovers the mechanics of how to control and feed fire. And from that initial discovery, he eventually figures out how to use that concentrated heat to melt certain rocks and forge early bronze weapons.
That is such a massive leap forward for humanity. He's taken them from fighting with crude chipped stones to wielding actual metal weapons.
Precisely. Because he introduced this massive technological leap, single-handedly pulling his people out of the Stone Age and into the Bronze Age, the psychological impact on his community was profound. The people he helped were so deeply grateful and so awed by his control over this dangerous element that after he died, they deified him. The inventor of the forge became the god of the forge.
I just love that perspective. He's not a magical immortal. He's just the first guy brave enough to keep a campfire going and experiment with rocks. And then there is the story of Sol, the fourth of these so-called god kings of Egypt. Kircher describes Sol not as a celestial body, but as an excellent mortal king and a supreme cultivator of civil justice.
He was a real law and order type.
Yes, the manuscript details a specific event. One day, King Sol catches a prominent woman in his kingdom committing adultery. To make a severe example of her and uphold the law, he doesn't just quietly punish her. He parades her throughout all the districts of Egypt, publicly rebuking her so that the rest of the society might learn a harsh lesson and live more chastely.
And this specific mundane historical event regarding ancient civil law, Kircher argues, is the factual seed that eventually blossomed into one of the most famous and poetic Greek myths of all time. If you look at Homer's poetry, there is the incredibly famous fable of Venus and Mars, the goddess of love and the god of war. They are having a secret, illicit nighttime affair.
And who catches them?
Exactly. Who is the one who catches them in the act and betrays their secret to the rest of the pantheon? It is the sun god, Sol, who sees everything from his vantage point in the sky. Kircher is telling his readers that Homer didn't just invent that cosmic soap opera out of thin air. Homer took the fading, distorted historical memory of the Egyptian king Sol publicly punishing an adulteress, and he elevated it into a grand cosmic drama between immortal beings. What's fascinating here is...
Wait, let me guess. There's a specific academic term for taking real people and turning them into gods, isn't there?
Exactly. The term is euhemerism. It is a concept named after an ancient Greek mythographer named Euhemerus. It is the theory that all mythological gods were originally just ancient kings, queens, conquerors, and heroes. They were real flesh and blood people whose historical deeds were so impressive or so technologically advanced for their primitive times that they were gradually exaggerated over centuries of oral tradition until they transformed into mythic deities.
So Kircher is basically using euhemerism as his primary tool.
Yes, for Kircher, mythology is not a collection of random fairy tales or spiritual allegories. It is a highly distorted, poeticized version of real political history. When the later Greeks write beautiful poems about gods throwing lightning or performing magic, Kircher reads it as a corrupted record of ancient Egyptian kings utilizing early science, statecraft, and elaborate stagecraft.
That completely reframes how you read these ancient texts. But as logically satisfying as that is, as Kircher moves chronologically forward in time away from these early foundation myths, the problems with the historical record don't get better. They actually get significantly worse.
Much worse.
Speaking of centuries of exaggeration, moving into the era of the 16th dynasty, the era of the Hyksos or shepherd kings, it seems like the linguistic puzzle completely breaks his brain. Why does he struggle so much with something as simple as the name shepherd?
Because the secular historians he is reading completely contradict the biblical timeline he is trying to defend. He is faced with a massive interpretive fork in the road. Why are these powerful Egyptian rulers called shepherd kings? Kircher cites two entirely different historical theories.
Okay, let's hear them.
One theory, which is heavily supported by Eusebius, a Christian historian from the 4th century who obviously favored biblical interpretations, is that this dynasty gets its name because this is the exact historical moment when the sons of Jacob arrived in Egypt. The biblical patriarchs were literally shepherds by trade, arriving in Egypt due to a massive famine in Canaan.
And the other theory.
The other theory, which comes from Manetho, who was an actual Egyptian high priest writing in the 3rd century BCE, is far more secular and economic. Manetho suggests they were called shepherd kings simply because, at that time, the kingdom's vast wealth was not measured in gold or silver, but in vast herds of cattle and livestock.
And I assume, given everything we know about Kircher, he desperately wants the first theory to be true. He wants that biblical anchor.
Absolutely. This is where we see Kircher aggressively trying to bolt the chaotic Egyptian timeline onto the stable framework of the Hebrew Bible. For Kircher, the Bible is the most reliable, uncorrupted historical document in existence. So he looks at the 16th dynasty, he looks at the concept of shepherds, and he points out that this must be the era when the biblical patriarch Abraham visited Egypt.
Ah, the story with Sarah.
Right. If you read the book of Genesis, there is a famous, somewhat troubling story where a pharaoh abducts Abraham's wife, Sarah, because Abraham lied and said she was just his sister out of fear for his own life. By identifying this specific 16th dynasty as the era of Abraham's visit, Kircher creates a fixed chronological anchor point. He is saying, I know exactly when this happened in the Bible, therefore I know exactly when this dynasty ruled.
But creating that anchor point doesn't solve his biggest headache on the secular side, who was actually the first king of this shepherd dynasty. I was reading his breakdown, and it sounds like an absolute nightmare of conflicting sources.
Oh, it is. Everyone disagrees.
Kircher looks at his stack of ancient texts, and every single one gives him a completely different name for the founder of the dynasty. The Alexandrian Chronicle says it was a king named Sesostris. Someone else says it was Apis. Another source insists it was Mefre. Herodotus, the famous Greek father of history, and Diodorus both agree it was a king named Menes.
It's a historian's worst nightmare.
Truly. Kircher is staring at this mess, and the logical gymnastics he performs to figure it out are staggering. He decides he trusts Diodorus and Herodotus the most on this issue, so he goes with Menes, sometimes called Mena, but then he takes a massive, almost reckless leap. He declares that Menes is the exact same person as the Persian mythic figure Mithras, and also the exact same person as Misraim, the son of Cham we talked about earlier.
He just folds them all into one guy.
Wait, he just declares a Persian sun figure and an Egyptian moon figure are the same guy. How does he possibly justify that leap in logic? Feels like a massive stretch.
It is a massive stretch, but you really have to pay attention to Kircher's deductive reasoning to see how he talks himself into it. He relies heavily on cross-referencing behavioral descriptions rather than names. For instance, he reads the Roman historian Pliny. Pliny writes that a Persian king named Mithras was the very first ruler to build a massive obelisk, and that Mithras did this because he was commanded by a divine dream to institute the formal worship of the sun god. Then, Kircher puts that text down and reads Diodorus. Diodorus writes that an Egyptian king named Menes was the very first ruler to teach the Egyptian people how to properly worship the gods and perform religious rituals.
Okay, I see the trap he's falling into. Kircher looks at those two separate accounts and says, wait a minute. Pliny says Mithras was the first to institute religious worship. Diodorus says Menes was the first to institute religious worship. Therefore, because there can only be one first, they cannot be two different people. They absolutely must be the same guy.
That is exactly his thought process.
And he justifies the totally different names by arguing about linguistics. He claims that the native Egyptians called him Mena, which he relates to the word for the moon, while the Persians and Arabs called him Mithras, which relates to the sun. He is utterly convinced it is just one historical king who got completely rebranded by two different cultures over the centuries.
It is an incredibly dangerous assumption for a historian to make, driven entirely by his desperate need to unify the timeline at all costs. He is relying on a basic philosophical principle. Things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. If King A invented state religion and King B invented state religion, then King A is King B.
But history isn't math.
Exactly. Applying mathematical logic to fluid, corrupted human history creates a cascading effect of confusion. And nowhere is this confusion more hilarious and frustrating than when we look at Kircher's attempt to figure out who founded the ancient city of Memphis.
Oh, the founding of Memphis is the ultimate example of this ancient game of historical telephone. Kircher looks at his sources to answer a simple question. Who built Memphis? Herodotus plainly and confidently states that King Minos founded it, but Eusebius completely contradicts that. Eusebius writes that Memphis was founded by a ruler named Epiphas.
And you have to wonder where Epiphas came from.
All right, so I'm reading this and I'm thinking, who on earth is Epiphas? Well, to understand that, you have to look over at the Greek myth of Io. In Greek mythology, Io is a beautiful mortal woman who catches the eye of the god Jupiter. To hide her from his incredibly jealous wife, Juno, Jupiter transforms Io into a white cow.
A literal cow.
So Io wanders the earth as a literal cow, eventually arriving in Egypt. There, Jupiter restores her to her human form, and she gives birth to a son named Epiphas. And Eusebius, supposedly writing historical fact, says this guy, the son of the mythical wandering cow woman, founded the city of Memphis.
So Kircher is sitting there with a massive, glaring contradiction. Was Memphis founded by Menes, the great historical king, or was it founded by the offspring of a magical bovine? Kircher refuses to accept the magic, so he breaks it down by looking at the linguistic drift between the Greek and Egyptian languages over centuries.
How does he connect them?
He notes that around this exact same era, there was an ancient Greek king named Inachus, whose daughter was named Io. When she traveled to Egypt, the Egyptians later revered her and called her Isis, and her primary religious symbol was a cow. Separately, there was an actual Egyptian king named Apis, who was eventually deified as the god Serapis, and his physical representation on earth was a sacred, living bull.
Right, so you have Apis, the sacred ox, Apis, the deified historical king, the bovine goddess Isis, who used to be Io, and the Greek name Ephesus, all swirling around the exact same geographical area at the exact same time in history, being written about by people who don't speak each other's languages.
It's a linguistic pileup.
Kircher looks at this and basically argues that the Greeks and the Egyptians just got all their cow and bull terminologies completely crossed. The later ancient scribes took the historical name Apis, mashed it together phonetically with the Greek Epiphas, threw in the old poetic myth of the wandering cow, and created a historical mess that Eusebius later accepted as fact. Kircher cuts through all the animal husbandry and says, look, Minos, Mithras, Osiris, Apis, Epiphanes, forget the names. They are all just different corrupted labels for the exact same ruling entity at the time Memphis was founded. So what does this all mean?
It means you have to imagine the sheer chaotic mess of compiling ancient history before the printing press, before the internet, before standardized spelling. You're dealing with scribes separated by thousands of miles, hundreds of years, speaking completely different languages, all trying to record the exact same historical events.
It's basically a massive multi-generational game of telephone.
Absolutely. They are passing complex political stories down orally for generations before anyone bothers writing them down. They are translating foreign names into their own alphabets and often deliberately altering those names to fit their own cultural biases or local religious beliefs. Kircher's agonizing work in this chapter is a testament to how fragile the historical record truly is. He is trying to reverse engineer a shattered mirror piece by microscopic piece.
And he desperately needs that mirror to reflect the Hebrew Bible perfectly. Once we get past that initial linguistic nightmare, we move into section 3 of his chronology, the true pharaohs and the Hebrew timeline. We are moving into the 17th dynasty, which Kircher labels the Paulitans.
This is a major structural shift.
It seems like a crucial shift in the text, because this is the era where he notes Egypt achieves an absolute form of kingdom. The rulers finally stop being remembered as ambiguous, mythic god kings and are officially recorded in the histories with the formal title of pharaoh.
And this is precisely where Kircher's grand project becomes highly systematic and incredibly bold. Having established his initial biblical anchor with Abraham in the previous dynasty, he now meticulously maps the succession of these 17th dynasty pharaohs directly onto the narrative of the book of Exodus.
He goes king by king.
He does. He isn't just speaking in generalities anymore. He is aligning the secular king lists of Manetho and Eusebius with the biblical text, reign by specific reign, trying to prove that the Bible is historically flawless.
It is a chronological masterclass, even if you can tell he's forcing the math a bit to make the dates line up. I'd love to walk through exactly who he pairs up. He starts with an Egyptian pharaoh named Amasis. According to Kircher's calculations, Amasis is the specific pharaoh who was ruling when the biblical patriarch Jacob and his numerous sons descended into Egypt to escape a raging famine in the land of Canaan.
The story of Joseph.
Exactly. This is the pharaoh who meets Joseph, recognizes his administrative genius, and elevates him to be the first governor or vizier of Egypt. So, under Amasis, it is a time of immense prosperity, welcome, and cooperation between the Hebrews and the Egyptians.
Exactly. The secular records show a prosperous era, which matches the biblical account of Joseph's stewardship. But then Amasis dies, and eventually the scepter passes to a new pharaoh named Amenophis. And Kircher confidently identifies Amenophis as the exact historical figure mentioned ominously in the Bible as the new king who knew not Joseph.
That's a chilling phrase.
It is the tragic turning point in the biblical narrative. The Israelites transition from being honored, powerful guests of the state to becoming a feared, oppressed underclass forced into hard labor. Amenophis is the architect of that initial oppression.
And the oppression then escalates horrifically under his successor, Amenophis II, whom some secular Greek sources also refer to as Memnon. Kircher points to Amenophis II as the specific, ruthless pharaoh who issued the horrific genocidal edict ordering the killing of all male infants born to Hebrew women.
Leading to the story of Moses in the reeds.
Right. And finally, building on that tension, we get to the pharaoh named Senkers. Kircher, following the chronological math of Eusebius, identifies Senkers as the pharaoh of the Exodus itself. He's the one who stubbornly opposed Moses, suffered through the 10 plagues, and ultimately drowned in the Red Sea while furiously pursuing the fleeing Israelites with his chariots.
By firmly identifying these specific pharaohs, Amasis as the welcoming king, Amenophis as the oppressor, Amenophis II as the infant killer, and Senkers as the one who drowns, Kircher has entirely synchronized the Egyptian dynastic records with the core narrative of the Torah.
It's neat and tidy.
Very tidy. And while he is doing this heavy theological lifting, what I find fascinating is that he is also careful to mention the incredible physical monuments associated with these rulers. He doesn't want to lose the rich architectural history of Egypt in the midst of that biblical mapping. He wants to prove these were real men who built real things.
Yes, the monuments he lists are so cool, and it grounds the text in physical reality. For instance, during this exact era, he notes a ruler named Myris. Myris is credited in the secular histories with digging out massive, artificial lakes to manage the unpredictable floodwaters of the Nile, saving the country from drought.
Engineering marvels.
Even more impressively, he is associated with building the legendary Egyptian labyrinth, a stone structure so vast and complex it completely boggled the minds of ancient Greek tourists who visited it centuries later. He also built towering pyramids for himself and his wife. And then there is the famous colossal statue of Memnon, dedicated to Amenophis II.
The singing statue.
Yes. Kircher mentions that this massive stone statue was renowned throughout the entire ancient world because it supposedly made a prodigious sound, described as a musical note or a mourning human voice, whenever it was struck by the first rays of the rising morning sun. Modern geology and science tell us this was likely due to the expansion of the porous stone as it heated up, but to the ancients it was pure, undeniable magic.
Kircher also touches on the complex geopolitical shifts and internal conflicts of this era, including a bizarre story about how Egypt actually got its recognizable name. He relates the historical account of two royal brothers, Danagus and Ramesses. According to the text, Ramesses was a violent tyrant who violently overthrew his brother Danis and stole the crown, forcing Danis to flee across the sea to Greece.
And then he renames the whole place.
Right. Here's an interesting part. Before this usurpation, the country was actually called Aria. But Ramesses was also known by another name, Aegyptus. When he seized absolute power, he was so arrogant that he renamed the entire country after himself, and it has been known as Egypt ever since.
It is wild to think that the enduring name of one of the most famous and studied civilizations in human history is just the ego trip of a tyrannical brother who usurped the throne.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes blindingly clear why Kircher prioritizes the Hebrew timeline over everything else, even when the Egyptian evidence is compelling. For a 17th century Catholic scholar like Kircher, the Bible is not just a useful history book. It is the divine, uncorrupted, and absolute truth dictated by God. It is the ultimate, immovable, chronological anchor.
That's the one thing he won't compromise on.
Absolutely not. If the secular historians like Manetho reading temple walls, or Herodotus interviewing priests, or Diodorus traveling the Nile present a timeline that conflicts with the biblical account, Kircher's default unshakable assumption is that the secular historians absolutely must be wrong. They must have misunderstood the dates or misnamed the kings or been fooled by local superstitious myths. The Bible is the immovable center of the universe, and all other histories must be bent, folded, or radically reinterpreted to fit around it.
It is a massive jigsaw puzzle where he already knows exactly what the final picture on the box is supposed to look like, so he just jams the mismatched pieces in until they fit. Which moves us nicely into section 4 of his chronology, the greats, the arrogant, and the shapeshifters.
This is a fun era.
We are moving into the 19th and 20th dynasties, and this is where Kircher really gets to geek out over some of the most dramatic, larger-than-life personalities in Egyptian history. Let's start with the absolute superstar of the 19th dynasty, a king named Sesostris the Great.
Sesostris is a figure so immense in the historical record that his exploits rivaled and perhaps even inspired those of Alexander the Great. Kircher, relying on a multitude of awestruck ancient sources, describes him as a man who completely surpassed all his predecessors in glory and greatness of deeds.
He was a conqueror, but also a builder.
Very much so. He wasn't just a brutal military leader, he was a brilliant administrator and a massive patron of the arts and sciences. Under his reign, the study and carving of hieroglyphics flourished. He erected countless towering obelisks across this expanding empire specifically to document his achievements for eternity. He led massive global military expeditions, stretching the boundaries of Egyptian influence to the most remote corners of the known world, conquering lands the Egyptians didn't even know existed.
And his death is just as dramatically intense as his life. After ruling with absolute authority for 33 years, Kircher writes that Sesostris took his own life with eyes wide open. He didn't waste away from old age, he wasn't poisoned by a rival, and he didn't die in battle. He actively chose his own end out of a sense of sheer greatness of spirit, meeting his death with the exact same fierce intensity with which he lived.
He wanted to go out on top.
Exactly. His legacy was so intimidatingly massive that it cast a heavy shadow over the region for centuries. Kircher shares this amazing anecdote about the Persian king Darius to illustrate this. Centuries after Sesostris died, the Persian Empire successfully conquered Egypt. Darius, who is at this point the reigning, terrifying emperor of the known world, comes to the conquered city of Memphis. He decides he wants to erect a massive statue of himself right next to the ancient towering statue of Sesostris.
And this interaction is where we see the immense, enduring cultural power of the Egyptian priesthood. The chief priest of Memphis, a conquered subject, stands directly in front of Darius, the most powerful man in the world, and flatly tells him no.
The nerve of that guy.
Right. The priest publicly contradicts the emperor, telling Darius that he has not yet equaled the magnificent works of Sesostris, and therefore he does not deserve the honor of standing beside him in stone. And the truly incredible part of the story is how Darius reacts. He doesn't execute the priest on the spot. He isn't insulted into a rage.
He backs down.
He actually respects the priest's liberty of speaking the truth. Darius humbly agrees, saying that he will strive to be inferior to none of Sesostris' virtue as long as he lives. It is a stunning testament to how deeply the reverence for Sesostris was embedded not just in Egypt, but in the psyche of the ancient world.
Unfortunately, Sesostris' son did not inherit a single drop of his father's greatness. His successor was a king named Pharaon, or sometimes recorded as Nuncorius. Kircher describes him as deeply arrogant and impious. In a fit of bizarre hubris during a terrible storm, Pharaon supposedly grabbed a spear and threw it directly into the violently rushing waters of the Nile River, which was an act of extreme religious disrespect to the very lifeblood of Egypt.
And he paid the price for it.
Big time. As immediate divine punishment for this impiety, he struck completely blind. He suffered in darkness for years before finally appeasing the gods through elaborate rituals and regaining his sight, after which he desperately scrambled to erect huge obelisks to prove to the gods and the people that he had learned his lesson.
We see a very similar theme of extreme arrogance met with divine humbling with another ruler in this era, a king named Thorus. He ruled roughly around the time of the Trojan War. In fact, the Greek poet Homer calls him Polybus and writes that he actually hosted Menelaus and Helen of Troy in Egypt when they fled the fallen city.
Oh, wow. Crossing over with the Iliad there.
Yes. Thorus was incredibly proud of his vast military conquests in Africa. He returns to Egypt flushed with victory, marches into the sacred temple with immense pride, and arrogantly demands of the oracle, who before me was ever able to subject all things to himself, and who will ever be able to do so after me. He is fully expecting the oracle to validate his supreme, unmatched greatness.
But the oracle totally humbles him. The response is swift, poetic, and devastating. The oracle replies, God himself first, then the word joined to the flame. It's a profound ancient theological smackdown, reminding the arrogant king that mortal military power is fleeting and entirely secondary to the divine order of the universe. The oracle basically tells him to stay in his lane, warning him, you take the unsure path of life with most certain feet. It's a beautiful, chilling moment of mortal hubris being checked by ancient wisdom.
Following Thoris, we enter the 20th dynasty, which is marked by a significant structural shift in governance. There are no supreme kings ruling over a unified Egypt for a time, just regional governors chosen from wealthy, worthy families. And this fractured period gives us one of the most fascinating and satisfying examples of Kircher's rationalization of myth. He introduces a regional governor named Cetes, whom the visiting Greeks later recorded as Proteus.
Yes, Proteus. If you know your basic Greek mythology, Proteus is the legendary shapeshifter. He's the mysterious old man of the sea who can completely change his physical form to escape capture. The Greek myths say that if you try to grab him, he will instantly turn into a roaring lion, then morph into a wild boar, then a massive dragon, then a leopard, then a rushing stream of water, and finally a towering tree. It is one of the most magical, surreal, and fluid images in all of classical literature.
And here's where Kircher, channeling the pragmatic historian Diodorus, completely and utterly demystifies the magic. He provides a totally grounded, rational, and frankly obvious explanation for the supposedly magical shapeshifting. It all comes down to the elaborate ceremonial regalia of the Egyptian rulers.
The outfits.
The outfits, exactly. The kings and governors of Egypt did not wear simple gold crowns like European monarchs. They wore elaborate, highly symbolic, culturally specific headgear, depending on the specific religious ceremony or state function they were attending. On one day, honoring a specific god, a ruler might wear the actual pelt and hollowed-out head of a lion. On another day, they might wear a headdress adorned with a bull's horns or a helmet carved with the terrifying image of a dragon. During harvest festivals, they wore headdresses made of fragrant, woven branches or even elaborate apparatuses that held burning incense fire.
Okay, so put yourself in the shoes of an ancient Greek traveler visiting Egypt for the very first time. You don't speak the language, you don't understand the religion, and you attend a series of state ceremonies over a week. On Monday, you see Governor Cetes sitting on a throne wearing a terrifying, realistic lion's head. On Wednesday, you see the exact same guy wearing a dragon headdress. On Friday, he's walking around with literal fire and branches sprouting from his head.
You'd think he was changing shape.
Exactly. The Greek visitors saw this wild, rotating, ceremonial wardrobe, got completely confused, or maybe just decided the truth was too boring and became overly poetic, and went back home to Athens to tell tall tales about an Egyptian ruler who could literally transform his biological body into animals, trees, and fire. They invented literal magical shape-shifting out of a simple misunderstanding of local fashion and ceremonial pomp.
It is a perfect encapsulation of Kircher's entire thesis. The magic wasn't real, but the history was. The Greeks didn't invent Proteus out of thin air. They observed a real man, Governor Cetes, engaging in a real, documented cultural practice, and they simply lost the context in translation.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because as we move into the 25th and 26th dynasties, the stable political landscape of Egypt descends into absolute chaos, and the historical stories get incredibly vivid and specific. We are jumping ahead to a period of foreign rulers, brutal civil wars, and bizarre, world-changing coincidences.
We begin this chaotic era with the 25th dynasty, which is founded by a foreign conqueror and Ethiopian king named Sabakus. Now, when you hear the word conqueror in ancient history, you usually brace yourself for stories of ruthlessness, burned cities, and bloodshed. But Kircher highlights Sabakus as a uniquely moral, philosophical, and humane king. He was deeply pious and possessed a strict, unyielding sense of personal integrity. One of his most notable revolutionary acts upon taking the throne was completely abolishing the death penalty in Egypt.
Which is practically unheard of for an ancient absolute monarch. Instead of executing convicts, Sabakus put them to work. He bound them in fetters and had them labor on massive public works projects, specifically building huge protective embankments and digging vital irrigation canals throughout the Egyptian cities. Kircher notes that this was a brilliant, pragmatic move. It softened the harshness of the punishment, while simultaneously turning the wasted labor of criminals into a massive economic and agricultural advantage for the country. He built infrastructure instead of filling graveyards.
But his reign ends in a deeply psychological, almost horror-like way. Sabakus begins having a recurring, terrifying dream. In this dream, a major god worshipped at Thebes appears to him and tells him that his reign in Egypt will never be truly secure or happy unless he commits a horrific, unthinkable atrocity. The god demands that Sabicus gather all the priests of Egypt, slaughter every single one of them, and then physically walk through their dead, mutilated bodies to consecrate his absolute power.
That is a nightmare of Shakespearean proportions. Yeah. The god is basically telling him, you have to become a monster to keep your throne. But Sabicus's reaction is what makes him so fascinating to me. He doesn't wake up and start executing priests to secure his power. He summons all the priests to the palace and tells them exactly what he dreamt. He tells them that he flatly refuses to gain a secure kingdom through wicked, unholy murder. He states he would rather leave Egypt pure and free from crime than stain his own soul and his hands with their blood.
So he just leaves.
Yes. So he makes a stunning choice. He voluntarily abdicates the throne, hands the entire kingdom back to the Egyptians, and peacefully walks away, returning to his homeland in Ethiopia.
It is a profound, shocking rejection of the typical tyrant narrative. It shows Kircher's deep appreciation for complex historical figures who grapple with morality, conscience, and divine will. But Sabicus's noble departure leaves a massive power vacuum, and Egypt immediately spirals into violent turmoil. After a couple of brief, failed reigns, the country is without a king for 2 full years, engulfed in a bloody civil war. To finally stabilize the bleeding nation, the Egyptians try a radical political experiment. They divide the absolute power. Instead of crowning one pharaoh, they appoint 12 regional chieftains to rule the entire kingdom together in an oligarchy.
The dynasty of the 12 men. This sounds exactly like the setup for a great political thriller. And it all hinges on an incredibly strange, seemingly mundane event involving a bronze helmet. The 12 men rule together relatively peacefully for 15 years. One day, they all gather at the Grand Temple of Vulcan for a major, highly publicized religious festival. It is the last, most sacred day of the festival, and the high priest is supposed to hand each of the 12 rulers a solid golden bowl so they can pour a sacred libation to the gods in unison.
But the priest makes a simple, fatal mathematical error. He brings out exactly 11 golden bowls for the 12 men. The bowls are handed down the line of chieftains, and the 12th man, a ruler named Psammetichus, is left standing at the end of the line, empty-handed and awkward. Now, Psammetichus doesn't panic, and he doesn't want to disrupt the sacred ceremony. He just wants to participate in the ritual. So he casually takes off the bronze helmet he is wearing, because all the rulers were wearing their military armor for the occasion, and he uses his own bronze helmet as a makeshift bowl to pour his libation.
It is a completely innocent, improvised moment. But the other 11 rulers see him do this, and they absolutely freak out. Why? Because they suddenly remember a terrifying, long-forgotten prophecy from the oracle. The oracle had foretold years ago that whichever of the 12 men offered a libation from a bronze bowl would eventually become the sole, absolute king of all Egypt. When they see Psammetichus holding that bronze helmet, they don't see an innocent mistake. They think he has deliberately, cunningly orchestrated this entire situation to fulfill the prophecy and overthrow them.
Paranoia instantly destroys their 15-year alliance. The 11 rulers strip Psammetichus of all his political power and banish him to the remote, swampy, inhospitable marshes of Egypt, thinking they have effectively thwarted the prophecy by getting rid of him. But of course, as anyone who reads ancient history knows, trying to aggressively avoid a prophecy is usually exactly what causes it to come true. While banished and stewing in anger in the marches, Psammetichus stumbles upon a group of heavily armed Ionian and Cimmerian mercenaries who had accidentally shipwrecked on the coast. He uses his hidden wealth to hire them, builds a private technologically advanced army, marches back out of the swamps, and forcibly, violently conquers the other 11 rulers. He becomes the sole king of Egypt, exactly as the oracle predicted.
The bronze helmet prophecy fulfilled. Psammetichus rules for decades, stabilizing the country, and eventually the throne passes down his bloodline to his grandson, a king named Apries. And Apries' story gives us another incredible tale of betrayal and, weirdly enough, another crucial historical helmet. Apries is a successful king for a while, but he makes a huge, catastrophic military blunder. He sends his army on an expedition against the Cyrenians, and the Egyptian forces are absolutely slaughtered. The surviving soldiers are furious. Paranoia sets in. They believe Apries intentionally sent them into a meat grinder just to weaken the military's influence so he could rule more comfortably without their interference. So the army mutinies.
Apries is suddenly facing a full-scale, heavily armed military rebellion. To calm the explosive situation, he sends his most trusted, persuasive advisor, a man named Amasis, to negotiate with the mutineers and talk them down. Amasis arrives at the rebel camp, stands before the furious soldiers, and starts giving a passionate speech, trying to persuade them to lay down their arms and remain loyal to King Apries.
But while Amasis is speaking, a rebel soldier sneaks up behind him, holds up a military helmet, and plops it right onto Amasis's head. The rebel shouts to the crowd that he is crowning Amasis to the sake of the kingdom, and Amasis just rolls with it. He doesn't fight back. He doesn't take the helmet off. He stops his speech, accepts the makeshift crown, and immediately declares himself the new king, preparing to march the rebel army against his old boss.
When King Apries, waiting in his palace, hears that his most trusted negotiator has just stolen his entire army, he is enraged beyond reason. He sends another loyalist, a man named Protarbamin, with strict, impossible orders to arrest Amasis in the middle of a hostile camp and drag him back to the palace. But Amasis has the entire army behind him. Protarbamin obviously can't arrest him and is forced to leave. When Protarbamin returns to Apries empty-handed, Apries completely loses his mind. In a fit of blind, tyrannical rage, Apries orders Protarbamin's nose and ears to be brutally cut off.
And that horrific act of cruelty is the fatal mistake. Apries brutally mutilates his own loyal messenger just for failing an impossible task. When the rest of the Egyptian nobles and soldiers who are still loyal to Apries see this horrific cruelty, they are utterly disgusted. They realize Apries is an unhinged monster who will turn on anyone. So the rest of his loyalists immediately defect and join Amasis's rebellion. A massive battle ensues. Apries' remaining mercenary forces are crushed, and Apries himself is captured and strangled to death. Amasis takes the throne, all because someone sneakily put a helmet on his head mid-speech.
It is a stunning cinematic sequence of events that highlights the extreme volatility of power in the ancient world. But it also shows how these historical anecdotes full of vivid, shocking details like severed ears and bronze helmets are precisely the kind of stories that survive the centuries. They get etched into cultural memory and enthusiastically passed down by historians like Herodotus because they are so compelling.
Which brings us to the final act of Kircher's chronological deep dive, Section 6, the final magic act. We are skipping ahead past the Persian conquest to the 32nd dynasty. We are going to look at the very last indigenous Egyptian pharaoh before the Greeks, specifically the forces of Alexander the Great, take over completely. His name is Nectanebus, and Kircher describes him in a way that brings us full circle back to the beginning of our deep dive, back to the dark arts of Misraim. Nectanebus is not just a king, he is a master magician.
Kircher, pulling from the more fantastical historical accounts, writes that Nectanebus relied heavily on enchantments, illusions, and dark magical tricks to maintain his fragile grip on power. He supposedly used magic to extort secrets about the future from demons. Kircher specifically details his use of an ancient magical practice called lucanomantia.
I saw this bizarre term at the text, lucanomantia. It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel. What exactly was Nectanebus doing in his royal treasury with this?
It is essentially the classic scrying pool technique. Lucanomantia is a specific form of divination that involves gazing deeply into a bowl full of still water, often in a dark room, to induce a trance state and see visions of the future or distant events. Nectanebus is supposedly down in his treasury, looking into his magic water bowl, and he sees a terrifying, incredibly clear vision. He foresees that the powerful Persian king, Artaxerxes Ochus, is preparing a massive, unstoppable invasion force to conquer Egypt. And Nectanebus sees, with absolute certainty, that he cannot win this war. His magic won't save his armies.
So what does the master magician do when he sees doom approaching? He doesn't stand and fight like a noble king. He goes down into his own royal treasury, loots immense amounts of gold and precious stones, shaves his head, puts on a peasant's disguise to completely hide his royal identity, and sneaks out of his own country in the dead of night, abandoning his people and fleeing all the way across the Mediterranean to Macedonia.
And this cowardly flight to Macedonia sets the stage for one of the most scandalous, consequential, and historically debated deceptions in all of ancient history. While hiding in plain sight in Macedonia, Nectanebus uses his magical arts, or rather his skills as a master manipulator and illusionist, to infiltrate the royal court. Specifically, he targets Queen Olympias, the powerful wife of King Philip of Macedon. Now, to understand the massive historical significance of this, you have to know the famous myth surrounding the birth of her son, Alexander the Great. The enduring, world-famous legend states that Alexander was not the son of the mortal King Philip, but was actually the literal son of the supreme god Jupiter Hammon, who supposedly visited Queen Olympias in her bedchamber in the form of a serpent or a divine, terrifying apparition.
Right, the classic, my dad is a literal god, justification for conquering the entire known world. If you want people to bow to you, telling them your father throws lightning bolts is a pretty good political strategy. But Kircher, Citing a later historian named Joseph Ben-Gurion, enthusiastically endorses a completely different, totally scandalous, and highly grounded version of the story. According to this account, a god didn't visit Olympias. The runaway Egyptian magician Nectanebus did. Nectanebus bewitched the queen using his incantations, or perhaps just extreme charisma and drugs, to plant visions in her sleep, convincing her that the god Hammon was going to physically visit her and give her a divine son who would grow up to rule the whole world.
Once he had thoroughly convinced the queen of this impending divine prophecy, Nectanebus put on his ultimate disguise. He dressed up in the elaborate, terrifying ceremonial garb of the god Hammon himself, which likely involved the massive curling ram's horns associated with the deity in Egypt. He slipped into the queen's chambers in the dark, slept with her under the complete guise of divinity, and physically fathered Alexander the Great himself.
It is the ultimate deception.
This raises an important question about how history is actually written, and more importantly, who gets to write it. History is traditionally written by the victors. But in cases like this, Kircher is suggesting it is written by the clever magicians, the poets, and the propagandists who know exactly how to turn a massive political scandal, an illicit affair between a married queen and a runaway disguised king, into a divine, unquestionable mandate. Alexander the Great aggressively used his supposed divine parentage to legitimize his brutal conquest of the known world, including the conquest of Egypt itself. The myth of his divine birth was the ultimate political tool, forged in the bedroom of a deceived queen by an Egyptian exile playing dress-up.
It is the ultimate ancient long con. Nectanebus loses his Egyptian throne to the Persians, but through this massive deception, he fathers the Greek kid who will eventually grow up to destroy the Persian Empire and take Egypt back. It's an incredibly satisfying full-circle story to end the dynastic timeline on.
So, as we finally reach the end of this dense, exhausting journey through Kircher's timeline, we have to step back and make a final assessment of the man and his mission. Did Athanasius Kircher actually succeed in his grand attempt to create a unified, mythosynthetic Egyptian chronology? The answer is a very complex mix of undeniable folly and unexpected brilliance.
Let's talk about the folly first, because it's pretty glaring once you see the mechanics of it. We watch Kircher perform some truly chaotic, deeply flawed equivocations of names. He forces completely disparate historical figures together, insisting that Menes, Mithras, and Misraim are all the exact same person, just to make his puzzle pieces fit his preconceived theory. He assumes that if two people built an obelisk, they must be the same guy. It is a textbook, centuries-old example of extreme confirmation bias. He desperately needed the Egyptian records to validate the biblical timeline of the Exodus and the patriarchs, so he hammered, twisted, and broke the secular histories until they aligned with his religious worldview. It shows the extreme danger of starting your historical research with an unshakable conclusion already firmly planted in your mind.
That is undeniably true. His methodology regarding names and dates is fundamentally broken by modern standards. But we also have to recognize Kircher's underlying success, which lies in his core philosophical thesis. Even if his specific pairings of names are completely wrong, his central idea, his rigorous application of euhemerism, is profound. He recognized, perhaps better than anyone else in his era, that ancient mythology is not just a collection of random, imaginative fairy tales invented to entertain children. Mythology is the distorted, heavily stylized telephone game remnant of real political history, real people, and real natural discoveries. When he explains Vulcan not as a magical smith, but as the observant man who discovered how to feed a fire, or Proteus not as a magical shapeshifter, but as a ruler wearing rotating ceremonial masks, he is performing brilliant, deeply rational historical analysis. He strips away the magic to reveal the incredible human ingenuity beneath.
And that brings it all back to you listening to this right now. We can look back at the ancient Egyptians and Greeks and laugh at how they turned a guy who could keep a campfire going into an immortal god, or how a simple misunderstanding about translating cow names led to wild, bizarre myths. But how do we consume information today? With the internet, deepfakes, algorithmic echo chambers, and 24-hour news cycles, the game of telephone hasn't stopped. It's just moving at the speed of light. Are we still prone to turning our political leaders, our tech billionaires, or our celebrities into infallible gods or irredeemable monsters through our own modern myth-making? How much of our current, deeply held historical record is just the modern equivalent of someone completely misinterpreting a bronze helmet?
It is a fascinating puzzle to consider and a completely different way to look at the stories we tell today. Because if Athanasius Kircher was right, and all of ancient mythology is just exaggerated, misunderstood human history, what completely mundane, everyday events happening right now, in our era, will be remembered as literal magic by human beings 3,000 years in the future. When the historians of the year 5000 look back at the scattered, mutilated digital records of the 21st century, what ordinary piece of our technology or culture will they write down as the work of gods and wizards?
It's an incredible thought and a completely different way to look at the stories we tell today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We loved unpacking this bizarre, brilliant manuscript with you.